Thank you all very much for coming this evening. And I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of the Queen Mary Law School, the International State Crime Initiative, and the QMUL Human Rights Collegium. I'm the director of ISCI, the International State Crime Initiative, and I'm standing in tonight for Dr. Thomas McManus, whose initiative this event was. And I should say that this will be the first of a series of events. We want to continue the conversation, the discussion around Grenfell and the multiple layers of complicity involved that we need to discuss. As everyone in this room knows, that on the 14th of June, 2017, the 24-storey Grenfell Tower block of public housing flats in North Kensington caught fire, killing some 80 residents. For those of us working on state and corporate crime, the tragedy of Grenfell bears all the hallmarks of state-corporate collusion and state-corporate crime. Tonight's event will be the first, as I said, what we hope to be a series of events which will seek to understand the structural and organised nature of these crimes and how justice must be achieved for the survivors of Grenfell. Tonight we're delighted to have a panel of truly eminent speakers, experts on crimes of the powerful, human rights, housing and health and safety regulations, on fire, amongst other things. In a moment I'll hand over to our chair, Dr. Daniela Naj, but for the moment I want to say how especially honoured we are to have a number of family, friends and residents from the Grenfell Tower block with us tonight. And a special thanks to them for coming. It must be still an extremely difficult time. I also want to say thank you to the people who organised this event. As I said, Thomas McManus can't be here this evening for the very good reason that his baby is imminent. But also Dr. Daniela Naj, Nicole Lieberman and Louise Wise and Mark Byrne all worked incredibly hard to make this evening happen and to be a success. I just want to say that we will assume that unless we hear otherwise, that you would all like to be on ISCI's mailing list. So unless you don't wish to be, please notify us, but you will be included, so you will be informed of all the events that we hold here at Queen Mary and at other venues. So for now, I'd like to say thank you again very much for coming. It's a privilege to be able to host an event of this kind at Queen Mary, and I'll hand over now to our chair, Dr. Daniela Naj. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Penny, for the kind introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight for this very important debate, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're absolutely delighted and privileged to have you here tonight. My name is Daniela Naj. I'm a lecturer in public law here at Queen Mary, and I'll chair this event tonight. I will briefly tell you about the proceedings, then introduce each of our speakers separately, and then also read out a statement on behalf of the Justice for Grenfell group, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight, but they have asked us to read out that statement on their behalf because I think it is important to hear their words. So we're absolutely delighted to have a panel of experts, of residents, human rights activists, lawyers, fire safety experts tonight with us. We will start off with Joe Delaney. Joe Delaney lives in the area next to Grenfell, to the Grenfell Tower. He's been a very vocal activist and campaigner for the families, the residents, the victims, and I think he will give us a very good insight into what happened on the night of the 14th of June, what events preceded this disaster, and also what can be done on the ground now and what kind of justice people are seeking, those affected on the ground. This will be followed by Dr. Vicky Cooper, who is a lecturer in criminology at the Open University, and she also researches state crime, and she will talk about Grenfell Tower as a housing violence. Next up will then be Professor David White from the University of Liverpool, who is also a criminologist, and both Dr. Vicky Cooper and Professor White are the authors of The Violence of Austerity, which is an excellent book, I think, that touches on many aspects that we're going to discuss tonight. And Professor White is going to discuss the violence of financial capitalism. He also researches state corporate crime. Then we will have Hilda Palmer all the way from Manchester. Hilda is an activist, a housing activist who works for the Hazards campaign, and she will discuss We Love Red Tape tonight. And also feel free to pick up some of the leaflets and magazines by the Hazards campaign. This will be followed by Professor Steve Toombs of the Open University. He's also a criminologist who researches state crime, corporate crime, and he will talk about, and I'm sure this will be of interest to many of you, Grenfell as corporate manslaughter. We then have Matt Rack, who is a fire safety expert. He's the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, and he will talk about the deregulation agenda. We then have our very own here at Queen Mary, Professor Geraldine Van Buren, who's a professor of international human rights law, a formidable expert on socioeconomic rights and children's rights. She's also a visiting research fellow at Kellogg at the University of Oxford, and she will discuss the human rights perspective related to the tragedy. She is going to talk about the human right to housing and what this means, and she's of course also AQC. We then have Helen Wildbohr of the British Institute of Human Rights. Again, they're located in our building, so we're delighted to have them here tonight. She is a senior human rights officer, and she's going to talk about the accountability for those responsible under the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. And last but not least, we have with us, we're delighted to have John Cooper, QC, with us. He is one of the leading criminal barristers and human rights barristers in this country with 25 Bedford Row. He's been involved in many judicial review cases, including into the public inquest into the death of Dr. David Kelly, and he has also acted on behalf of some of the Occupy protesters outside of St. Paul's Cathedral, and he will be involved in the public inquiry as well. So we're absolutely delighted to have him here tonight, and his talk is going to be titled Grenfell and Doing It Justice. Okay, so before we start off with tonight's proceedings, as I mentioned, I will read out a statement on behalf of the Justice for Grenfell group, Yvette Williams and Sue Caro, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight, but they have asked us to read out the statement, so I will do this now. We are sorry that we're unable to join you today, but I'm sure you appreciate why. We thank you for your continuing support for what is undoubtedly going to be a long and hard-fought battle, to obtain justice for the victims and to bring to account those responsible for the worst UK peacetime disaster since the war. Grenfell Tower is emblematic of the deep inequality that exists across the United Kingdom, the entirely predictable result of the systemic disregard for ordinary people and their basic rights. Grenfell Tower is the result of putting profit before people. A council that has been Tory since 1964 has been conducting its own internal, to quote David Cameron, bonfire of red tape for many years. A council that boasted about its financial management, enabling it to give a £100 rebate to its wealthy residents. You were only eligible for this rebate if you had paid your council tax in full in one payment, whilst cutting services for everybody else. People have paid for this with their lives, and now those responsible appear to be engaged in attempts to play down the real scale of the disaster and avoid prosecution for their abject failures. There is no doubt in the minds of the survivors, the wider community, many across the United Kingdom and further afield, that austerity kills. Cuts, corruption and incompetence all contributed to the disaster that is Grenfell. On the ground, even whilst the fire was raging, the community filled the void left by those whose role it is, who are paid from the public purse, to deliver on behalf of all. The total abdication of responsibility by the council for this disaster that they created was and is mind-boggling. Every action since the fire has further increased the community's distrust in the authorities and strengthened our resolve to pursue justice. The official narrative that the residents of the tower were poor and mostly immigrants is a distortion of the truth. Many occupants of the tower were highly educated professionals, media workers, designers, entrepreneurs, health workers, and so on. Not poor people, but victims of a political approach to housing that has seen rent and house prices spiral out of the reach of the majority. Who can forget all those Tory MPs who are also landlords, voting against rented property being fit for human habitation, or the sneering dismissal of the need for a rent cap from the massed ranks of Tories, aided and abetted by the mainstream media. Justice for Grenfell is currently focused on the public inquiry remit and terms of reference. It is vital that the inquiry looks at all the contributing factors that led to the inferno, as well as what happened during and after the fire. Longer term, our focus will be on compensation for the victims and criminal prosecutions of those responsible. We have the support, insight, and experience of other similar campaigns such as Hillsborough and Bloody Sunday. We've spoken to the media and campaigners from across the globe, including Australia, Brazil, and Algeria. We mean business. You can help us with your continued support. Follow us on Twitter @officialJ4G, retweet our messages, sign up on our website for updates, www.justiceforgrenfell.org. We need to ensure that the Grenfell story doesn't drop off the news agenda, as the government and their supporters want. Please help us to achieve justice, and by doing so, making sure that the continued degradation of vital public services and erosion of basic human rights across the entire United Kingdom comes to a stop. Yours in solidarity, Sue Caro and Yvette Williams, Justice for Grenfell campaign coordinators. And with that, I'll open the proceedings, and Joe Delaney, you will be our first speaker.
Well, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to you guys for organising this. Yeah, and thanks for listening for a start, because it seems that those in central government still seem unwilling or unable to do so, quite sadly. The Grenfell Tower was certainly an avoidable disaster. It was certainly a predicted disaster. All you have to do is visit grenfellactiongroup.wordpress.com and you will see the tireless recording of the way that the council have behaved throughout this appalling tragedy and before this tragedy by the tireless editor there, Francis O'Connor, who is based in Ireland. Francis left the tower in 2013 and moved back to Ireland. However, he is still, as he said to me more often than not, he's kept his heart in the tower block and his heart in the area. And I'm certainly very glad that he did, because without him we wouldn't have such a valuable resource that we can call upon to prove the hubris and greed that led to this decision. I noticed that tonight's talk, it was called the Avoidable tragedy. But the main thing to consider is that it's not just avoidable, it's ongoing. You know, I was dealing with issues this morning from residents of the tower who still are being messed around by the council in terms of this £5,000 that's been promised to each of them. I've been dealing with issues concerning housing for many of them, because the offers that they're being made by the council are frankly a joke. You know, so a family that was already in an overcrowded one-bedroom property are being told, well, we're offering you a one-bedroom, so you're getting like for like, you know, and then they can at least say, well, that box is ticked, you know, and therefore Miss Strong and Stable's promise has been kept. I don't like to make this issue political, because frankly I think Labour have just as much blood on their hands when it comes to this matter as the Tories do. You only have to look at the actions of the Labour council, say in Lambeth, and see how they've treated residents there when it's come to regenerations. You know, residents on the Haygate estate have been treated just as badly. Thankfully no one died there, but it's the same principle. You know, the land you are on is worth more than the people who are on this land, and we will take it from you by whatever means we can. And even those who supposedly bought their properties are made absolute jokes of offers when it comes to the compensation that they receive when their properties are compulsorily purchased. So they don't even have a chance of buying somewhere else within the community that they've probably grown up in, you know, and have all of their links in. And I don't think that's right, and I'm sure many here don't either. In fact, I don't think anyone right thinking would say that that's sort of an acceptable or proper way for any government to treat any of its citizens. The consultation and planning that went into Grenfell Tower's regeneration, and I hate using that word because frankly the only regenerations I've ever liked are the ones of Doctor Who. Even the latest one, I have to say, despite the storm on Twitter about it. It was an absolute joke. Various people raised several points about the fact that there wouldn't be access for fire vehicles and things like that, and they were dismissed by Jonathan Ball, who was still the head of planning at RBKC to this day. I raised the point with him about the academy, and I said, well, it looks like we're going to lose our footpath that's one side of it. can you give us a guarantee that that won't happen and that you will refuse any retrospective planning applications that the Kensington Aldridge Academy may make? And he said at the time that he was unable to do so. Now, of course, we know the reason that he was unable to do so, but it was because he didn't want to. And he knew damn well that those retrospective planning applications were going to come in, because they already knew what they planned for it, because K&C actually went to great lengths to actually have a right-of-way in that area moved. And anyone who knows about these things will know that, you know, it's easier to get Stonehenge moved than it is to get a right-of-way moved in this country, as the Ramblers Association so often used to their advantage. The procurement for the block as well. Even if these people are claiming to follow the letter of the law, one thing that I found disturbing was the fact that even though this was an official, the official journal of the European Union procurement process, that's a hell of a mouthful, isn't it? The OJEU, you can look at the documents on the EU website, just Google OJEU procurement Grenfell Tower, and you will see there that there were certain things that were promised in this tower that just weren't delivered, including the type of cladding that was used. You know, for a council that claims that it's followed the letter of the law, I find it very surprising that all it took was one email from the deputy head of the council at the time, Councillor Rockfield in Mellon, in order to get the cladding changed, because he wanted to save 200 and something thousand pounds, because he felt it was running over budget. Councillor Rockfield in Mellon, by the way, is a councillor who is currently working to give away North Kensington Library to a local private school, the Notting Hill Prep. I'm sure it's a complete coincidence that his children are down on the waiting list for the said school. You know, I certainly wouldn't want to be accused of slander. As I've said as well, preventable and ongoing. You know, the housing offers that have been made for tenants, as I've said, have been an absolute joke. And they are just being made at the moment so that Theresa May can say that her promise has been kept. I find it ironic that Theresa May is willing to spend £1 billion to stay in her own home, and yet a few £100,000 couldn't be spent for us to stay in ours. You know, I live in one of the 3 blocks that's attached to the tower. There are 3 of them, Hurstway, Testerton and Barrington. And I live in the Barrington block, which happens to be on the side where the one road access was. And the fire started that night at about 12:55 a.m. And I was out witnessing this from about, I don't know, it was about 1:05 or 1:06 in the morning. And I hate to say, but it was by 1:30 in the morning I knew for a fact that people were going to die. And I knew that lots of people were going to die. And so what I did at that point was I used my skills from my job, because you see, I'm not an illegal immigrant. I didn't come into this country on a floating door, which is what the Daily Mail will have you believe everyone on this estate did. I was head of insurance of risk at Brent Council for several years, and I still work in the insurance and risk management field. And so at that point I was thinking, what would be the worst evidence that they could face if this thing actually, if I'm actually proven right and people die in that block? And so whilst other people were pointing their cameras at the tower in sheer horror, I was pointing mine at the road and showing the catastrophe that was down there, where my neighbours of mine had to go out and do 3-point turns in their cars to try and get them out of the way, in the hope that they'd be able to make space for the fire vehicles to come through. You know, sadly that didn't prove to be the case, and they were still only able to get 1 or 2 there. When it comes to the fire issue as well, I've heard a lot of criticism for the firemen. And I totally disagree with that. When the firemen were able to get access to that building that night, I saw chaps running in without helmets on or without breathing equipment on. They were that desperate to get in there and do something. You know, there's been talk about the fact that they didn't have equipment that was able to reach high enough. Well, I doubt, you know, your average fireman is the person who's in charge of procurement of such things, you know, so who does that go back to? Again, it goes back to Boris Get Stuffed Johnson. And get stuffed was the phrase he actually used with someone when they were raising concerns about fire station closures and cutbacks to the fire service that were being made in London. You see, and it's that hubris that's continued throughout this process. And what really gets my goat is that central and local government are still trying to deal with a PR catastrophe at the moment. That's the way they're looking at it. Even Gold Command, this supposed shiny organisation that's been brought in, you'll notice, to advise Kensington and Chelsea Council. Darlington Council screw up a few things instantly in special measures, you know, and a commissioner is brought in who can actually say this will happen. Oh, the richest flagship Tory council in the country has issues. Oh no, we'll just send in an advisory body. You know, and frankly, Gold Command have been proven completely useless. And the way things are going, I soon expect them to be placed with Platinum Command or some other stupid name for an organisation that will be just as weak and ineffective. The housing issue for the Tower residents isn't just the only housing issue that's ongoing. Not again.
So sorry about this disruption. I hope that we can continue tonight's debate now without any further interruptions. Joe unfortunately had to leave us because he has another engagement tonight. He's speaking at another event. So unfortunately we couldn't conclude with his final summary, but if anybody has questions or would like to raise something pertaining to Joe's debate or his talk, then please let us know, and I'm happy to direct those questions to him directly. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Vicky Cooper of the Open University, and she will discuss, I think, well, the impact of austerity on what happened at Grenfell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to talk, and thanks for organising this really important, significant event. I'm sorry Joe had to leave, and sorry for the fire alarm, but at least now we know where the fire exits are, right? Yeah. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the sort of levels of housing violence, and just do a bit of kind of comparing and contrasting, or rather situating what happened at Grenfell Tower on the map of housing violence. Over the last few years now, Dave White and I have been working through ideas of the violence of austerity, and this was all based on the rising levels of suicide, the unravelling of benefit-related suicides, increasing deaths in the NHS, as well as the rise in evictions and levels of geographical displacement happening in the housing sector. So in the wake of austerity, we really started to want to talk about and think about austerity not only as a fiscal policy that exacerbates, increases inequality, but also as a violent economic policy that has direct, violent effects on those most affected and targeted by the policy. It's an important point. Austerity policy by design is targeted. So what happened at Grenfell Tower is by far the most naked form of austerity violence. But since as shocking and as terrifying as Grenfell Tower was, as the fire was, we can really see it, and certainly I can map it on a scale of more general systemic violence that has happened, particularly in London, but also in the UK since 2010. Grenfell Tower is part of systemic form of violence caused to tenants in London, and Joe was starting to highlight that. So I'd just like to continue and pick up on some of those discussions that he was highlighting. There's been a level of routine and everyday housing violence happening here in London and elsewhere in the UK since 2010. It was happening also under the Labour government at the later part of 2000, certainly under regeneration projects, but this housing violence really amplified under austerity measures that came into effect in 2010. Since the onset of austerity measures in 2010, the state has eroded and dismantled what little housing security and housing protection that we had. And in addition to this dismantling of housing protection and security that we had, we've also seen a relentless level of land grabbing, where financiers and private property investors have seduced, and we're seeing this in Haringey right now, have seduced local councils and social housing conglomerates into selling their land to free up the market value and to make a very significant and large profit. And altogether, these processes, the sort of dismantling of housing protection and then the land grabbing, these processes are having quite significant and violent physical and psychological harms for those tenants who are most affected. When the deadly welfare reforms came into effect, I call them deadly because we've seen a number of suicides since they've come into effect. We saw the bedroom tax benefit caps and changes to local housing allowance, which massively reduced how much people can actually afford, the extent to which people can afford properties to rent in London and elsewhere. We also saw under the shared accommodation rates, overnight we saw 90,000 more people limited to shared accommodation rates. That's multiple occupancy accommodation. In the beginning, and to assuage public concern and public anxiety and anger, I don't know if you remember this person, Ian Duncan Smith, who quietly left, he said, come on, it's not as though we're going to go into your homes and physically remove you from your homes, but they did. And in 2010, Boris Johnson laughably tried to oppose the austerity measures and said, and I quote, "On my watch, you are not going to see thousands of families being evicted from the place they have been living and where they have put down their roots." But Boris Johnson did the exact opposite. Rather than defend the people in London when the austerity measures come into place, as he said he would, which is, although it's laughable, he authorised the social cleansing of several London boroughs and allowed authorities to send an army of agents and an army of enforcement officers to forcibly remove people from their homes for not paying their rent, or authorise property developers to come in and just simply move people from social housing estates for those property developers to free up the value of the land. Since the austerity measures come in almost overnight, London has turned into an eviction hotspot. If you look at that, Shelter has a really interesting map of the eviction hotspots in the UK. London is the main eviction hotspot, where people are violently, forcibly evicted from their homes on a day-to-day basis. In 2016, we saw 170 people evicted per day. This is mainly in the rented sector, social housing, council housing and private rented sector. The last time we saw this scale of eviction was before municipal housing came into effect. The last time we saw this level of eviction was in the early 1900s. So we've gone right back. In terms of progress, we haven't progressed at all in terms of housing protection and housing security. And we saw this form of violence most visibly in the Sweets Way estate. I don't know if anybody here from London remembers the Sweets Way estate. When in 2014 to 2015, Guy Hans, property developer and owner of the social housing conglomerate Annington Homes, decided to demolish the entire Sweets Way estate, evict 140 families and send them out of the area in order to redevelop the land to make it more profitable, design more profitable property. This culminated in the forceful removal of 140 people. Some moved voluntarily, and I use that loosely because it's still forced, but it's not documented. Some moved voluntarily, but it culminated in the forceful removal of a disabled tenant, Mustafa, as well as the campaigners who were there to help and support Mustafa. What happened was Barnet Council not only sent in the police, but they also sent in the High Court Enforcement Officers. For anybody who doesn't know, High Court Enforcement Office is a private company that's contracted out by the government to actually get rid of squatters, to evict families from their homes. And like most debt collection and enforcement companies, since 2010, the profits of these organisations, private organisations, has massively increased. Meanwhile, the government turns a blind eye to the violent intimidation and violent harassment of these enforcement companies in order to evict tenants from their home. As Samuel Beckett once said, why send in the murderers when you can send in the bailiffs? So we're seeing this level of violence, we've seen this level of violence occur, and this is just one example that I'm giving you. This is Sweets Way example. And as in the case of Grenfell tenants, you know, Joe mentioned the point about the ongoing violence, not the violence that happened, but the ongoing violence. As in the case of Grenfell tenants, when the tenants from Sweets Way were about to be evicted, Barnet Council came out and said, don't worry, we'll house you in plenty of time, we'll house you before, you know, the bulldozers come in and start, you know, demolishing the estate. But they never. Not only did Barnet Council fail in their duty of care to rehouse the tenants, Barnet Council then claimed that those tenants were intentionally homeless because they failed to take up the first offer of housing. I've worked in homelessness and I know for a fact the first offer of housing is the shittiest offer that you will get, so they're in the right, everybody's in the right to refuse the first offer of housing. People were moved permanently to Birmingham, to Luton, and even where families were moved to London, they were moved so far away that they had to pay extra money to go to their jobs to send their kids to the same school. And this form of geographical displacement is so mainstream and it's so common, routine now in London. One newspaper, The Independent, claimed that, from leaked papers, claimed that we're seeing 50,000 homeless families in London, geographically dispersed and displaced outside of London. Pertinent to the Grenfell inquiry is the case of Titina Nozolomiso from Westminster. She was evicted from her house, and when she went to Westminster City Council to be rehoused, they tried to send her to Milton Keynes. She was evicted because she couldn't afford her rent after the benefit caps come into place. When she refused the first offer, which was in Milton Keynes, the shittiest offer, she went to the appeal court, and one of the 3 judges at the appeal court, most of you will know now, is Martin Moorbeck. Martin Moorbeck decided that actually the local authority of Westminster was in its full right and entitlement to rehouse Titina in Milton Keynes. Putting this in perspective, Titina has 5 children, she is HIV positive, type 2 diabetes, and they thought that it was perfectly right to send Titina to Milton Keynes. And this is quite significant when we think about the judgment of social justice of a judge leading such an important public inquiry. Generally, people often fail to see the physical and psychological harms of displacement by eviction. The eviction process itself and being purged from one's home is extremely violent and extremely painful, as I'm sure some of you here may have experienced or know people who have experienced it. Studies in other countries show that eviction can induce psychological harm, such as anxiety, depression, and worst case scenarios, suicide. We've seen similar devastating effects. We've seen people commit suicide in Newham Council, people who were evicted in Newham Council. We've seen other people, Lee Robinson, Mark Scott, Richard Sanderson, Francis McCormack, Nigel Firminger in Kilburn in London, all commit suicide when they were evicted or were threatened with eviction. So how do we make sense of these different scales of housing violence, of the routine and everyday violence that we're seeing in London, with the type of violence that the tenants suffered at Grenfell Tower? How do we join up the dots between these types of violence? As shocking as the violence was at Grenfell Tower, the severe neglect, the years of illegal decision making, the disdain for and contempt, as Aditya Chakraborty says, the contempt for the tenants at Grenfell is the same disdain and the same contempt that we've seen the other local authorities display for tenants in other areas, and the examples that I've just highlighted. And we're seeing this continuum of violence. I was just speaking with Joe there. This is like Grenfell didn't happen. We're seeing this continuum of violence now, especially when Haringey Council just announced its development, the Haringey Development Vehicle, where it's going to sell over £2 billion worth of land to private developers and a private conglomerate. So we have to think about, you know, where and how Grenfell Tower sits within the scale of housing violence that we've seen since the Austerity Committee effect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for this fascinating talk. Next up is Professor David White from the University of Liverpool.
Thank you. Thank you. So it's obviously very difficult kind of circumstances to be talking like this, and I think there are some issues that probably are not, don't seem to be at the heart of what we should be talking about that I want to raise. But Joe mentioned in his statement from the Grenfell survivors group that corruption was one of the primary concerns, and I don't think we should take that lightly. I think we have to take it very, very seriously, because at the heart of the structure of the economy that allows us to understand, and I would argue produced that tragedy, is a level of corruption which has now become kind of normalised and etched into the system. And I want to try and just explain a few examples of that, because I think we have to take this very seriously indeed. There's a very chilling title to a book that I know and has kind of influenced my thinking by a woman called Jane Kelsey, called The Fire Economy. And in The Fire Economy, she uses fire as an acronym, FIRE, finance, insurance and real estate. And she says the logics, the ways in which finance think about how we should be as a society and the things that they do, their practices, the ways that they act in the finance industry, in the insurance industry, in the real estate industry, is dominating our lives and it is oppressing us, and it's creating all kinds of forms of corruption. Because what and we live in an economy now where actually when she says insurance, she means also the kind of securities, all of those products that are supposed to insure us against risk, those derivative products that fueled the financial crisis. So within that kind of logic, the idea is that you create value, and you try and create value out of nothing, no matter what the human cost is. And the best example for me is the way in which subcontracting works. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But there were 5 layers of subcontracting. There's 5 layers of subcontracting in the renovation of Grenfell in 2016. That's absolutely crucial to how we understand that, because at every layer of that subcontracting, costs were being forced down, actually labour costs very often, and value was being created for the people who were working on those contracts. And that's the same logic that's etched into our financial system, and it creates all kinds of collusive relationships. And I'm going to name just a few. There was a very good piece actually by I've forgotten her name, the Guardian journalist, Anna Minton, yeah, who detailed the leader and the deputy leader of the councils that again Joe mentioned, and their intimate relationships with property companies, their intimate relationships with development companies, and the number of times over the last year they've been wined and dined by the same companies that were trying to exploit opportunities like Grenfell Towers for profit. And that seems to be acceptable in the way that we run politics. If you go to the heart of government right now and think about the kinds of things that should have been done to protect the people at Grenfell, they're being determined in this revolving door relationship. So there's a couple of important regulatory authorities that are crucial for advising government and maintaining regulatory standards in building. The first one is called the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. And the Building Regulations Advisory Committee directly advises the Minister with responsibility, Javid, on building in terms of the regulatory standards that it should apply. It's almost exclusively staffed by people who are making money out of the industry. There's no trade union representatives, there's no residents representatives on that body, and in fact one of the people who's on that body is a guy called Mark Allen, who's the technical director of St. Gobain. Now they're the company that manufactured the materials that the Metropolitan Police right now is testing, because it was the material that's supposed to be part of the flammable material in the cladding. He's advising the government on regulatory standards. If you look at another key body, and in fact it's a good example of what my colleague here, Steve, talks about as privatised regulation. BRE Global has a 3-year contract. It's an autonomous organisation. It's made up again it's comprised by industry representatives, and it has a 3-year contract from the government to investigate issues that may have implications for building regulations. I'll tell you one thing BRE Global has said as recently as April 2016. It found the safety regulations in Britain on cladding adequate. I'll just leave that there. BRE Global said that. Now, the task force that Javid has just set up, the independent expert advisory panel on the cladding, has half of the representatives of BRE Global as on this panel. That's not a revolving door. They're all sitting in the same room, deciding the regulations are adequate, and then being appointed to actually test the adequacy of the regulations. Now, it's very difficult to call that collusion because, of course, it's legal. In the laws that we have, this is entirely legal. Well, it may be legal, but it's very clearly a form of collusive corruption that we shouldn't be tolerating in this. We see it in the PFI economy. It's incredible the way in which the PFI economy has made some companies bloated and has ensured that actually there is a culture of impunity which is developing around those huge public building projects. Grenfell Tower renovation wasn't a PFI, but the company that ran it grew fat off PFI. Ryden grew fat off, some of you will know the contract in Chalcots, which now they had to evacuate tenants there. Same contractor, Ryden involved in all kinds of PFI deals. And the point about those PFI deals is it brings contractors into a role that we would never have dreamt of giving them before, because they are given multiple roles in organising multiple tasks, which they then subcontract out, which they then don't have responsibility for, or claim they don't because they're subcontracted out. One of the points of subcontracting is to devolve not only responsibility, but accountability, and make sure there's impunity in the system. It's the point that what there is a Kensington and Chelsea tenants management organisation running the building, because that organisation gives the people involved in it limited liability. They're not liable for any losses. And when tenants have to complain, they can't go direct to the council, they have to go to the tenant management organisation at every level in the system. And when it comes to the renovations, through the supply and the subcontracting chain, there is a level of impunity being built into that, where we're never quite sure who's accountable for what. And these kind of structures of impunity are there to stimulate the economy. They're there, we're told, because if we have too much regulation, we stifle innovation, or we stifle enterprise. I'm not going to say much about that because I know there are other speakers on the panel who are going to talk about in more detail this so-called bonfire of red tape, which was there. But I do want to say that there are some fundamental questions that we have to ask about the financialisation logic, or the financial capitalism logic of regulation. Because as we know, look, Kensington and Chelsea is a relatively wealthy council. It might be the second wealthiest in the country. It had the money to regulate. It chose not to do so. Now, it's very difficult to get the information right now, so this is speculative. But I know that the building inspectors in Kensington and Chelsea, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, in the last 2 years have had 2 campaigns on regulation. One has been about the aesthetics of buildings, and they've prosecuted builders who put advertising on the side of buildings because it spoils the look of the buildings, right? The other thing that they've prosecuted over is noise. Now, I'm not saying either of those are important. In fact, they launched a campaign in April 2016 around noise. It's the main campaign around what's happening in terms of so-called regeneration in the area. And people have been prosecuted for noise, right? I think there is a priority here. At least we have to ask questions about how particular forms of regulation, which tie in with and support the gentrification of the area, are at the same time allowing the essential human protection, social protection forms of regulation that ensure the integrity of buildings, the safety of buildings, not to be observed. It's part of an austerity economy as well, without a doubt. I'm not denying that. The fire service, I'm sure we'll hear from about this later. The fire service have been cut back by at least a quarter in the last 5 years. We've seen reports of the reduction of inspections of tower blocks, fire audits of tower blocks. The Financial Times reporting 28% falling. So we have a structure of regulation which is dominated by those financial logics which relegate human protection, social protection to those logics. And I'm going to leave you with 2 examples that I still find actually unbelievable. I can't believe that this is these things have kind of reached the surface and not been questioned. Within 6 days of the disaster, Ryden, it was announced in the construction press that Ryden, the same contractor, was going to be given a £38 million contract by Ealing. It wasn't even questioned. There was a speculation. It looks like they're going to get the contract. 2 days later, it was announced they were going to get the contract. So we don't even think about freezing the contracts on the contractors that have been implicated, and I'm careful about what I say, but Ryden are the prime suspects in the police's current investigation now, and it's still being doled out with getting public sector contracts doled out without question. A second point, which I kind of find unbelievable, that Sajid Javid, again the minister that I noted, who's been given the prime responsibility for responding to this, he issued a statement in an interview 2 days ago where he said all local authorities will have to take all measures necessary to deal with the problems around the country they find with fire safety. He knows. He's the head of a government that's cut local authorities by 40%. Local authorities are in a crisis point now, and the government are turning around and telling them to take the money out of the pockets. And by the way, we're talking about the local authorities that are least able to pay are not in the same position as Kensington and Chelsea. So we have a financialised logic that remains in the system that I think we really together have to challenge in order to open up some fundamental questions about how we run our economy and how that economy can lead to something like the catastrophe at Grenfell Tower.
Next up is Hilda Palmer of the Hazards Campaign.
Thanks very much. Hazards Campaign, Hazards Magazine, Families Against Corporate Killers, Dave White and Steve Toombs and many others here and many of you out there have probably been campaigning and saying for years that a lack of good health and safety and the deregulation of health and safety kills. It's killing at work, it has been doing for years, and it is going to go on and kill more. We've been saying that and people haven't been listening to us. I wear my slogan on my chest here, we love red tape because it's better than bloody bandages. And that should be obvious, self-evident, it is evidenced. It's better to have bloody bandages than dead bodies. Should be obvious, but it absolutely isn't, and they absolutely are not listening to us. So this is true at work, at home, and in the environment. Joe was right to talk about the Labour Party and Labour governments being as implicated in this and having blood on their hands as much as the Tory government. I think we must remember that neoliberal governments for the last 40 years have been deregulation. Deregulation is central to neoliberalism, and we had Thatcher's bonfire of regulations, and her deregulation then became Brown and Blair's better regulation, was exactly the same sort of thing. Light touch, limited touch, flexible, the most flexible workforce in Europe. Do you remember Blair boasting about that? I'm sure he will be very pleased about its culmination in the foul gig economy, which is devastating workers' lives and health at the moment. And then we come to Cameron in 2010, who ramped it all up with his claiming health and safety was a monster, an albatross around the neck of business. And in 2012, he made it his New Year's resolution to kill off health and safety culture forever. And they did huge amounts of damage in that period in the coalition, that 5-year term. And in the 2015, the Tory General Election Manifesto confirmed that deregulation was still a priority, better regulation, getting better and better, which Steve Toombs has written about very brilliantly. Where does that end logically? He's written a paper called Better Regulation, Better for Whom? And then we had the Brexit referendum, and Theresa May came to power and again reconfirmed that deregulation and deregulation of health and safety was a very big thing for her, although she did talk about addressing burning inequalities. I think we can just dwell on that a little. We sent her a postcard saying, stop it, you're killing us, and urging her to look at health and safety. We got the most anodyne letter about which we will submit to the public inquiry as part of our evidence, really. And now we have Brexit, and whatever you voted and why ever you voted, whether you voted in or out, I think we must all be aware that Brexit is seen by the Brexiteers, people like Oliver Letwin, as another excuse to deregulate, and they've been very, very clear about that. And he set up a new red tape challenge, and a group that he organised on building materials and building regulations was actually convened on the day of the Grenfell fire, and they were looking at how they could get rid of more health and safety regulations controlling the use of materials like the cladding and the insulation and everything like that. They claimed that on that day they didn't actually decide to reduce any, but I wonder what they would have done if Grenfell hadn't happened that morning. So when I saw the Grenfell fire, I was horrified, saddened, angry as hell, but I wasn't entirely surprised because Grenfell is the result of the deregulation that we've been seeing over the last 40 years and particularly over the last 7 years. It's about the discarding of critical fire, building, products and environmental and workplace health and safety protection, both the laws and their enforcement. It wasn't a one-off, it's not an accident, but an incident that was foretold by the residents, forewarned by fire experts, the FBU, the all-party parliamentary group, and it was foreseeable and utterly preventable, and it should have been. Caused directly by government policies. Cameron called for a bonfire of red tape, and Grenfell was his obscene bonfire of real people. In Scotland, they actually did listen to the warnings after fires. In England, they didn't listen to Sam Webb and other people's suggestions after the Lacknell fire and actually review the building regs and do something about it. But in Scotland, after the Irvine fire, when some people died in I think, Ayrshire, they did actually review their building regulations and change them, which is why there haven't been any deaths in high-rise buildings in Scotland, and none of their cladding panels, I think, have come up as being flammable. I agree with John McDonnell and Steve and Dave and other people use this term social murder. I agree that the deaths of the people at Grenfell is social murder, or maybe it's state murder, state terrorism. At work, workers die usually in ones and twos, invisibly. Nobody really knows about them. Occasionally they die in larger numbers. But again, most of you probably won't have heard of them, I'm sure. How many people know that 2 years ago this week, 4 people died in Bosley, in a wood flour mill, which had been taken over by an incompetent employer who allowed wood dust to build up. And most of you will know that if dust builds up and in the right combinations, it can become explosive. It exploded, and 4 people were killed, many more were injured. The whole community was utterly devastated. One of the workers was vaporised and has never actually been found. And Didcot, where workers were demolishing a boiler house of the Didcot power station, and they were under the structure, 10 stories high, full of loads and loads of metal, tons and tons of it, and they were cutting the uprights to weaken them, preparatory to explosively demolishing them, and the building came down. 4 workers were killed, 1 was found right away, 3 workers were under 38,000 tonnes of rubble for 6 months before they found them. But mostly, workers die in incidents at work, relatively invisibly. They become injured and nobody really hears about them. They die of illnesses caused by their work, at home, in hospital, in hospices, and nobody really knows about them. Grenfell has changed all of that in the sense that it was public, it was visible, and the Grenfell survivors are making sure that we know all about it and everybody's getting behind us. Even the tabloids were talking about deregulation having gone too far. So, deregulation attacks on health and safety, they're all based on lies and propaganda backed up by the corporate tabloid press. I think it's really incredible to see the tabloid press actually talking about health and safety in a positive way for a short period. But the Daily Mail had a cover with a picture of Grenfell on it and said, how did this happen? How did it bloody happen, Daily Mail? Because you spent your whole time pouring out poison about how health and safety is completely useless and stupid and we should get rid of it. How do they do this? We've had endless reviews of health and safety, endless reviews. Hampton reviews under Blair and Brown, the Lord Young review, which wasn't worth the paper it was written on, was based on no evidence at all and was just particularly made up under Cameron. We've had other reviews about all of this, but they're always on biased terms. They're never, let's see how good health and safety is, how we can make it better, how we can stop people being killed, how we can stop people being made ill. They're always based on the fact that it's a truth that health and safety regulation is a burden on business, it's unnecessary, it's stupid, and we must get rid of it. Never about how is it a social good, what is the value of it, it's a moral imperative not to kill and injure people. That is never the case, so they're always biased. Some of the lies it's based on as well is that modern work, modern life, it's very little harm now. People say, not many people get killed at work. Well, they actually do. At least 1,200 people are killed in incidents at work every year. About 50,000 people die of illnesses caused by their work. 620,000 people are injured. About 2 million minimum are made ill every year. That's out of a workforce of 32 million. But just think about that. The higher the risk, the further you go down the pay scale, the lower your wages, the higher your risk. So most of those figures are actually borne by the bottom half or third or quarter. And so it's very unevenly unevenly born. And work is becoming, how much is that? Work is becoming more stressful and making people really, really ill. We have all this nonsense about it's just red tape and conkers, bonkers and all the rest of it. Employers will do the right thing. Well, we know that's absolute rubbish. Sam Webb has said about the whole cladding and insulation stuff and what's going on the outside of buildings. He said it's like wrapping aluminium foil around a firelighter, slapping it on the outside of the buildings and hoping for the best. Health and safety is not a burden on business. It's only a burden on excessive profits. And it costs an enormous amount. Poor health and safety costs between 30 and 60 billion. The people who pay that cost are the people who are hurt or killed, their families are people who are killed. But even so, the individuals pay 57% of the financial cost. We pay 24%, and the employers who cause that only pay 19%. So what do we want now? We've got to keep Grenfell in the public eye. We've got to make sure that we support the families, and we get as much justice as we possibly can for them. We want as broad an investigation as possible. We have asked for ministers and prime ministers to be interviewed under caution. We want corporate manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter and high-level health and safety charges to be brought if they can find the evidence, and Steve's going to talk a bit about that. And we want to keep pushing the responsibility, the accountability and the culpability up to the top. And we also want the inquiry to be as broad as it possibly can and look at the whole deregulatory framework in which Grenfell happened. And basically we need independent, fully funded health and safety enforcers with health, safety and welfare as their primary and only goal. Not at the moment, where they have to actually consider the impact, they have a growth duty on them, and they have to consider the impact of their regulation for health and safety on the growth and development of those businesses. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Steve Toombs is up next.
Thanks. I sent a tweet out last night which said something like corruption about Grenfell, corruption not cladding, social murder not corporate manslaughter, by which I meant, you know, cladding's part of the issue, but it's not really the issue, it's corruption, as Dave's indicated. And corporate manslaughter is an issue, but it's not really the issue, it's social murder. And I'm going to kind of focus on those last two things. But I'm going to say something in my 10 minutes about corporate manslaughter. As I say, not because the law is the main way of preventing corporate and state harm, far from it, but it is one tool that might be used in that struggle. And I also say this, I talk about corporate manslaughter as someone who's not a lawyer. That's the kind of thing, you know, the kind of way you introduce yourselves at parties. Hello, my name's Steve and I'm not a lawyer, right? So I'm not a lawyer. It's been the case for about 50 years in this country, in the UK, that companies could be prosecuted, could be tried for corporate manslaughter. But to do so, it also had to be the case that one or several directors or senior or owners of that company also had to be tried for gross negligence manslaughter, tried as individuals. Without one, the individuals being tried, the companies couldn't be tried. And that meant that only a handful of very small companies were ever successfully prosecuted for corporate manslaughter, where the corporation could be identified with the small business owner or the sole director of the company. And in the wake of a series of disasters, Clapham, King's Cross, Ladbroke Grove, Purley, Piper Alpha, Bradford City, football stadium disaster, Hillsborough, Zeebrugge, it became very clear that the law, as it stood, couldn't deal with large, complex organisations, which also, of course, managed to kill many, many more people in one hit than very small companies that could partly be captured by the law. That led to a law commission set of proposals in 1996 for a reform law of corporate manslaughter. That was resisted by major political parties for about 12 years until it finally came into law in 2008. But the key change in that long struggle over the process of the new law was that the original proposals by the Law Commission were proposals about corporate manslaughter, but also included clauses which allowed for directors to be prosecuted under that legal rubric. When business and indeed when political parties stopped opposing those proposals, when that clause was removed, and the corporate manslaughter law, which we now have on the books, doesn't allow, in fact explicitly says, that individual directors and senior managers have no liability. Section 18 of that Act. So, what's happened under this new law since 2008? That's 11 and a bit years, 9 and a bit years. There've been 21 convictions, 21 cases where corporations have been successfully prosecuted for manslaughter and 3 acquittals. None of those companies have been large organisations. None of those companies that have been prosecuted. All of them could have been prosecuted under the previous law, it seems to me at least, not being a lawyer, but I'm pretty certain about that, with perhaps one exception. What has happened, though, is that whereas previously the directors or senior managers used to have to be prosecuted alongside the company, under the new law they can't be, right? So under the new law, senior managers have been dobbing in the company, handing over the evidence as further immunity from prosecution outside the Corporate Manslaughter Act. So what we have is corporations, a small number, or small companies, ending up in the dock, but directors and senior owners, in fact, enjoying greater impunity. Okay, what does the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act require? It requires that the organisation at fault must be a corporate body, by which it means a private company, or a local authority. So both of those boxes get ticked in the context of Grenfell Tower. The responsible organisation or organisations must have owed a duty of care towards the person or persons who died, and the duty of care has to be of a particular kind, including, and I quote, organisations and manufacturers towards those who buy their products, local councils in the provision of particular services towards those receiving the services, other organisations involved in the supply of goods or services towards those receiving them, and organisations involved in construction or maintenance operations towards those affected by their activities. Tick, 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 in the context of Grenfell Tower. Further, for a prosecution, there must be a failure in the way in which the organisation, any of those organisations previously mentioned, in the way in which the organisation was managed or organised, which amounted to a gross breach of the duty of care I've just referred to in those different guises. This requires evidence that the failure, quote, fell far below what can reasonably be required. Reasonably be expected. It's also the case for a prosecution under the Act that, quote, a substantial element of the management failure must be at a senior management level. This is defined as the persons who play significant roles in the making of decisions about how the whole or substantial part of its activities of the organisation are managed or organised, and the actual managing or organising of the whole or substantial part of those activities. In other words, I mean, based upon what we know already, based upon what we know, Joe referred to the warnings of the Grenfell Tenant Action Group prior to what happened in mid-June this year. We know that senior management in the council, we know that senior figures in the tenants management organisation knew of the risks. We know that they knew of them, not least because of Lacknell and the inquests and the fire safety prosecution that finally came to an end in March of this year, despite the fact that the Lacknell house fire was in 2009. We know that there's prima facie evidence for a case of manslaughter to be taken against one or several organisations involved in the Grenfell Tower disaster. Doesn't mean that they'll be successful. Proving a gross breach and meeting the senior management test are both difficult feats in law and haven't yet really been tested under the new law. But that there's prima facie evidence seems to me to be absolutely clear. What would be the downsides of any prosecution of the council, of the TMO and the private contractors? Well, one of the downsides, I think, is that almost certainly senior individuals, going back to the point I made earlier, senior individuals in those organisations would evade legal accountability. They would exchange their threat to prosecution for the organisations, for the council, for example. They would guarantee impunity for themselves. Senior councillors would likely guarantee impunity were the council to be prosecuted, okay, for instance. The second and kind of ironic consequence of a prosecution, were it to be successful, was that the sanction, if let's say the council is successfully prosecuted for corporate manslaughter, then the sanction will be a fine. And the fines in the 21 cases up to this point have ranged from £8,000 to £600,000. And it's likely the case were the council, it's possible that the council would receive a fine higher than £600,000. Who would pay the fucking fine? Who would pay the fine? The fine would be dispersed to the innocent. The fine would be dispersed to the poll tax. It's not called the poll tax anymore, is it? I still think it's the poll tax payers. Right? The fine would be paid for by employees of the council. The fine would be paid for by the people who relied on the services of the council. Right? So that fine, whatever level it was, the higher it is, the greater would local people be hit, okay? Not the powerful people in that borough. That's also not to mention, by the way, the legal cost involved. Southwark Council, after Lackernall, spent £3.34 million in legal fees around the inquest, defending its role around the inquests in relation to those 6 deaths. That's not even to talk about the legal fees it incurred in terms of the health and safety charges for which it was or the fire safety charges for which it was eventually found guilty. So likely the poor would pay yet again. As always, title of a famous criminology book, the rich get richer, the poor get prison. What would be the good things that might come out of a successful prosecution or prosecution in this case? Well, I think the most important thing is it would send a symbol, it would send a message. It would mark what happened. What happened at Grenfell was many things, some of which we know about and some of which we're yet to find out about. But amongst those many things, it was a crime. And it would mark that out clearly. And to make the converse point, if there were not a successful prosecution, it would also kind of send out the other message, which is that what happened at Grenfell Tower wasn't really criminal. And we all know that it was a crime. We all know, despite the fact that most of us aren't lawyers. Illegally, I think there's a very strong case that Grenfell Tower will test a new law and will successfully test a new law, and the council at least will be the first large organisation to be successfully prosecuted under the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act in 2007. And if it isn't, I think that law will be proven to be worth less than the paper it's written on. But morally, to close where I began and where the others have referred to, morally, I think we also know that what happened at Grenfell wasn't manslaughter, it was murder. And it was, to use that phrase, which I've been using for a few years and has been circulating now around this disaster, this tragedy, it was social murder. And social murder, to remind you, was a phrase that was first used over 100 years ago, 1845, by a guy called Friedrich Engels, who was a good friend of someone called Karl Marx, who you will have heard of. And Engels defined social murder in this way, and I'll read this quotation out and I'll stop. When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such injury that death results, we call that deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call this deed murder. One-on-one intentional violence, we call it murder. But when, he continues, when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or the bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them to remain in such conditions until that death ensues as the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of a single individual. What happened at Grenfell Tower, Engels knew then, we know now, is social murder. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very powerful talk. Next up is Matt Rack. He's the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union.
Thank you for the invitation to speak here. And I think one thing we've found over the past few weeks is issues that we've been raising for many, many years are suddenly now being investigated by journalists, and we welcome some of that, but we have been saying it for a very long time. We are often dismissed by those in power as a sectional interest. The people lobbying for business aren't treated as sectional interest, but workers and their organisations are treated and dismissed as a sectional interest. We are a sectional interest. We represent, and Hilda mentioned some of those disasters, the people who've responded in each of those cases are members of the Fire Brigades Union who go to try and rescue those people in those collapsed buildings or in Grenfell Tower. or in other such situations. And what's unique, well, not unique about, there are other groups of workers who do this. There are workers who work in hazardous industries. One of the differences with our members is that they are deliberately sent in to hazardous conditions. And our response to that is they're happy to do that as long as they're able to do that in the safest and most professional way with the adequate resources. I think the other answer that we make to being dismissed as a sectional interest is that we have a long history of campaigning on much wider public safety issues. We've led campaigns for fire protection in buildings. We've led campaigns for improved fire protection legislation. We a key campaigner for the legislation on foam-filled furniture, which has saved many, many lives in domestic fires over the years. Again, one which under the deregulation regime, the testing regime was challenged, and the Fire Brigades Union was the body which challenged that downgrading of the testing regime in relation to foam-filled furniture. Now, in terms of the firefighters, and I'll come on to this a bit more, but Joe mentioned some of the operational side, and there's a much wider issue than the operational response to Grenfell Tower. But I will say something about that. Firefighters, to deal with those hazardous situations that they enter, follow procedures. They have certain equipment, they have specialist training, and they bring all of those together to be able to deal with hazardous situations as safely and professionally as they can. And what was absolutely remarkable, and the more I hear about it, the more remarkable it is that Grenfell Tower was so unusual in terms of the fires that we deal with, is that it completely was not planned for in any way at all. And therefore all the procedures that we rely on could not be applied, all the safety training that we rely on could not be applied, and people did remove their breathing apparatus. People who work in teams and are not supposed to split up did split up. People who are not exposed, who are professionals and not supposed to get lost did get lost. It is truly a miracle that we didn't lose firefighters that night. And the more I hear about it, the more of a miracle or a remarkable stroke of luck it is that we did. And I think, I suppose, one aspect of this is that if you are going to send people into those sorts of situations, then they also have the right to know how this thing happened, how this event, which nobody had planned or prepared or trained them for, but nevertheless asked them to go into, they have a right to ask how the hell this happened as well. And the question of austerity has been raised with me over the past few weeks. I think it is more complex than the immediate austerity that we're facing currently. It goes back, and other people have touched on this, several decades. The fire service that I joined in 1983 was actually quite a remarkable structure. I, as a recruit firefighter, knew about the national bodies that set standards on a whole range of issues, and I knew as a brand new firefighter my part in that organisation, which was the London Fire Brigade, which was part of a much bigger public service as well. And in 2004, under the new Labour government, all of that post-war edifice, all that post-war structure began to be dismantled under the new Fire and Rescue Services Act, which got rid of a whole host of bodies, which I'll come back to. But again, the fire service bit of this, the fire and rescue response, is only one part of it. We've seen the decimation and privatisation of building control in local authorities. We've seen in terms of the responsibility for fire risk assessments, again a deregulation approach. And I'm not saying that all fire risk assessments aren't qualified. Many of them are and are very able, but there are no regulations requiring people. People can set themselves up as fire risk assessments and tout for business without any comeback at all. In another inquest that we dealt with in relation to one of our members who died in a fire in Manchester, again it was found that the coroner found that the fire risk assessor had no qualifications whatsoever in relation to that building. So this is an issue that we've identified before but has not been addressed. The fire and rescue role, the fire and rescue service role in that is to audit the work of the fire risk assessors. But you then come on to what is the ability of the fire and rescue service to undertake that work. I was in Manchester today, Greater Manchester has 10 local authorities within it, the biggest being the City of Manchester. And I spoke to a fire inspecting officers aren't the firefighters you will normally see on fire engines. It's a very specialist role, or it should be a very specialist role, and in the past they were very highly trained, and there were quite a lot of them. In the City of Manchester, the fire inspecting officer I spoke to said that there were a team of currently of 3. They should have 4. They used to have 14 fire inspecting officers in the City of Manchester. So if you are auditing the work of the private fire risk assessors, and you're required under the legislation to have a risk-based programme of fire audits, well, of course, and I thank our colleague Dave Sibbett for pointing this out, you can have one risk-based audit programme if you've got 14 fire inspectors. The risk-based audit programme we have, if you've only got 3, is a completely different risk-based audit, but you still call it a risk-based programme of audit. And you see and that's where austerity begins to hit. We estimate that at least half of specialist fire inspecting officers have gone, and probably 2/3 have gone since 2005. So a complete programme of deregulation in terms of the wider environment in which firefighters are operating. You then come on to the firefighters themselves and the world that they live in. As I say, the service I joined was very well planned and regulated. We had national standards of emergency response prior to 2004. They were abolished, and what we now have is what are called integrated risk management plans. It sounds very grand. They're supposed to assess the risk in each local community and then decide what their plan is to prevent fires and other emergencies, and also to respond to fires and other emergencies. Again, under what it meant right from the start, actually, immediately after 2004, was actually a postcode lottery where national standards of response were abolished, and each service now sets its own target and then measures the performance of itself against the target that it itself has set. And you can immediately see some problems. And one that we highlighted and Newsnight exposed last week is that you can have a fire in exactly the same tower block, built by exactly the same architect, in one fire and rescue service, and you will get 6 or 8 fire engines turn up. You go across the county line to another fire and rescue service, and you will get 2 or 3 fire engines turn up. And how, again, so the postcode lottery entirely exposed by some of these facts. The Central Fire Brigades Advisory Council was a body, it was quite a boring body, but it set standards in terms of equipment, training, procedures. It had committees that looked at the fire protection of buildings, that might well have spotted some of these cladding issues around the world and might have asked for research. The CFBAC was abolished in 2004. And when we come to research, actually there is virtually no publicly funded fire research in the UK anymore. I visited in America, in the United States of all places, a fantastic federal research institute looking at fire research in terms of building construction, building reaction in fire, as well as firefighting and firefighting procedures. We have nothing like that in the UK anymore. So we operate in this completely deregulated position. And just finish on the Boris Johnson point, the person who Boris Johnson told to get stuff was actually Andrew Dismore. Andrew Dismore was previously a solicitor working closely with the Fire Brigade Union, who also actually worked closely with the Fire Brigade Union on the King's Cross inquiry. So it's not just dismissing a political opponent, it's dismissing a political opponent who actually knows something about what he's talking about. In terms of the inquiry, I think we want to work closely with residents and survivors. We want this to be as broad as possible. It needs to be thorough. We want to hold ministers to account. This was not an act of God. These are political decisions that have been made time and again by government ministers, who have been advised also by fire and rescue advisors, and they need to be held to account. On the question of Javid spoke at the Local Government Association the other week and clearly is trying to pass the whole problem onto local government. This is the problem, it's a local government failure. Actually, the people making the decisions are those at central government, and they're the ones who have to be held to account and dealt with accordingly. Thank you.
very much for this fascinating insight. Our next speaker is Professor Geraldine Van Buren of Queen Mary.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Daniela, Tom, and Nicole, for organising this. Following on from Steve's comments, my name is Geraldine, and I am a lawyer. And I want to do two things very briefly tonight. In addition to any criminal prosecutions that will be going on, I want to look at the cases that have been brought under the European Convention on Human Rights, under the right to life, which link the right to life and the right to housing. And the same provision is found in the Human Rights Act. And I want to do that not because I want a stream of cases going through, but because the case law is so strong that it points to the responsibility of the UK government in violation of Article 2 and the right to life. And that if this dossier of cases and arguments is presented to the government, hopefully the government would acknowledge, apologise, and pay swift compensation to the Grenfell Tower victims and survivors so that they don't have to continually wait and go through the pain of more case law. The second thing is I would like to call for an inquiry into the need to have a right to adequate and safe housing in UK law. This is a right that is found in a number of constitutions, an increasing number of countries around the world, and I think it's time for the UK to incorporate such a right here. So firstly, let's look at the right to life. And the right to life is thought of, popularly as a duty on a state not to kill anybody, and it certainly includes that. But there are also positive obligations involved in the right to life that are less well known, and it's these positive obligations that I think have great importance for those who survived the Grenfell Tower fire. Now, Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights says that everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. No one shall be deprived of their life intentionally. As I say, that's repeated in the Human Rights Act. And according to the European Court of Human Rights, there's a positive obligation on all governments to take all appropriate steps to safeguard life in the context of any activity. And this clearly applies to the laws, the policies, and the regulations concerning Grenfell Tower. Specifically, the European Court of Human Rights has considered cases in relation to Turkey and Russia where there has, unfortunately, been a loss of life coming from housing. So the question that has to be asked is, are the principles which emerge from these cases applicable to the government and applicable to Grenfell Tower? In a case called Oni Yildiz and Turkey, the court placed much importance on the fact that the authorities knew from information in advance that there was a risk to life, in that case, from a collapse of a municipal rubbish tip. Similarly, with Grenfell Tower, the risks would appear to be made known to the government. We had the information to be considered would be the Lucknall inquiry in 2009, the information provided by the All-Party Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group, which was presented to the authorities before the refurbishment, as well as the information provided by the tenants themselves. And in the Turkish case, the court found that the timely installation of safety systems before the situation would have become fatal was very relevant. And they asked a very specific question. They said, would putting those safety systems being possible, quote, without diverting the state's resources to an excessive degree? So similarly, it would be open to courts here and the government to consider whether the installation of safer cladding, sprinkler systems, whether that would have diverted the UK resources to, quote, an excessive degree. And I think the answer is no, very clearly no. Another factor relied upon by the European Court of Human Rights was the lack of an effective supervisory system, and this would also be considered in relation to Grenfell fire and the fire in safety inspections. A case brought in relation to Russia, where the court specifically said that there is less discretion in relation to governments where there is a risk of life, that the margin of appreciation is smaller. And under the European Convention on Human Rights, the government is responsible for all the actions of all its local authorities. And that's very clear. So in essence, the questions we have to focus on are what the government knew, what the government ought to have known from the knowledge communicated to it, and also critical is whether and how the government acted upon this knowledge. And as I say, the point of doing this is so that the victims don't have to go through and wait longer for inquiries and cases to go through the courts, but they can receive an apology, the acknowledgement, and compensation swiftly. Secondly, I want to look at the need for a right to housing inquiry. I think it's unlikely that that would take place within the existing inquiry. And if nationally it's refused by the government to have such an inquiry, it will be open to cities to host and hold such inquiries. This happened in the United States, in Madison County in Wisconsin. The city recognized everyone had the right to housing and that the right to housing was a human right, even though it's not a right recognized by the US Bill of Rights. So there's a lot of scope here for local authorities to consider this issue. And I haven't plucked the right to adequate housing out of the air because the United Kingdom has been party for over 30 years to a treaty called the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And this in Article 11.1 enshrines a right to housing, a right to adequate housing. And the committee issues general comments which are of persuasive value, but which we could use to frame a housing inquiry. And under the Covenant, it's very clear that the right to housing is a right for everyone. It is not dependent upon income. And that housing is not to be regarded as a tradable commodity. In human rights terms, the question is, everyone, how can we be effectively and guarantee the right to everyone to adequate housing? And the committee, incidentally, which the United Kingdom every 5 years now gives evidence to this committee at the United Nations, it's a public submission of evidence, it's a public consideration of the questions, and anyone can go. And the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has said, well, what does it mean, adequate housing? And there's great detail on this, but I just want to focus on the relevant parts in relation to Grenfell Tower. And they say, firstly, availability and accessibility. So there has to be access to emergency services. There has to be access to, and this would include fire alarms and all the safety systems. They look at habitability, and that includes, were there any structural hazards? Structural hazard would be a consideration of just one staircase down as the main fire escape route. They'd look at the adequacy of fire exits. There's cultural adequacy. When we're looking at fire access, do we actually consider larger families and cultural traditions in relation to that? They would look at accessibility. Has provision been made for those with disabilities, those who are slow because of age in relation to whether they're children or older persons to leave the building quickly in terms of if there were a fire? And all of this is found in the general comment. It's been published for a long time. And the World Health Organization has also issued principles in relation to housing and safety. And the UK, under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, is specifically directed to give priority to those who are vulnerable and in need. In other words, under the Covenant, social housing, public housing, becomes a priority rather than dropped to the bottom. So I would like for something to come out of this concrete, that consideration is made to thinking about exploring the possibilities of the European Convention on Human Rights and the right to life, and also to hold inquiries into this country to ask whether we now need a right to adequate and safe housing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Our next speaker is Helen Wildborough of the British Institute of Human Rights.
Thank you. My first thought when I was watching the events at Grenfell Tower unfold on television was this is a devastating tragedy, and your thoughts immediately go to the victims, the survivors and the families. But then my second thought, as the hours and the days passed and more information started to trickle out to us, was this is a human rights tragedy. And questions are there to be answered about the role of public officials in this tragedy. At local level, in terms of the concerns of residents about safety going unheard or ignored, about the design or refurbishment of the building, and then the lack of local fire safety procedures. And also at the national level, as has been alluded to, in terms of changes to the fire service and their powers and regulations on building safety. I'll explain in a bit more detail about that, but first I just wanted to say something about my organisation and our input here tonight. So the British Institute of Human Rights is a charity. We're very lucky to be based here in the School of Law at Queen Mary University, and our mission is to bring human rights to life here at home. So we only work on human rights issues here in the UK. We partner with the School of Law to form part of the Human Rights Collegium, and we're really pleased to be here tonight to support the event and to partner with the International State Crime Initiative, the other partner for the event, who's also based down the corridor for us at Queen Mary. It's becoming a bit of a theme of the night, but I need to say I'm not a lawyer. The British Institute of Human Rights mainly works to on how human rights can be used in out-of-court situations at that very local level. So we work to ensure that those with power here in the UK know about their human rights duties and what they need to be doing to make sure that our human rights are being respected, protected and fulfilled. We support voluntary and community groups to use human rights laws to hold those with power to account when they overstep the mark. But we also work to ensure people know about their own human rights. We produce lots of booklets and tools for people so that they can self-advocate on their own rights. So tonight, I'm going to talk about Grenfell Tower and accountability under the Human Rights Act. And in my 10 minutes, or less, if I can manage it, I'm going to talk about why the Human Rights Act is relevant to Grenfell, the different types of duties on public officials under the Human Rights Act, picking up on what Geraldine's just said, and what these duties mean for Grenfell. So can I just ask, before tonight, how many of you had heard of the Human Rights Act? That's pretty good. So I normally ask that at the events that BIHR do, and it's a lot fewer hands than that. So that's a good start. So I don't need to tell you then that the Human Rights Act is the main law in the UK which protects our rights here at home, passed by Parliament and came into force in the year 2000, and it essentially makes 16 of the rights from the European Convention on Human Rights, which Geraldine was just talking about, part of our law here in the UK, so it brings those into our law. So previously we had access to those rights only through the European Convention on Human Rights, and we had to go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg to get access to justice. So they're now essentially part of our law here through that Act of Parliament, through the Human Rights Act. Of the 16 rights, 3 particularly relevant to Grenfell. So the right to life, as Geraldine has mentioned, the right to respect for home, not a right to a home, but respect for the home that you have, and then right to peaceful enjoyment of possessions. These are the rights that have been used in other tragedies to hold public officials to account, not only for loss of life, but also for loss of homes and possessions within those homes. So, how does the Human Rights Act work? There are 3 main ways that it works, and they're all relevant to what's happened at Grenfell. First thing is that it puts a legal duty directly on public officials to respect and protect our rights. This means that public officials need to be thinking about our human rights in their day-to-day decisions. That means public officials like housing officers, others working at local authorities, police officers, fire officers. I'm going to come back to that in a bit more detail in a second because that's important for Grenfell as well in terms of where that duty lies. The second thing that the Human Rights Act does is where public officials fail in that duty to protect and respect our rights, we can now take action in our local courts in the UK and ask a British judge to decide whether our rights have been breached. So it sets up a system of local accountability and local access to justice. Finally, the third thing that the Human Rights Act does is it underpins all the other laws and policies and guidance out there. So all of the laws, all of the regulations should be compatible with the rights in the Human Rights Act. And where we don't think they are compatible with the rights in the Human Rights Act, we can again ask a judge to decide whether they are, and if those other laws and regulations and policies are falling short, we can ask Parliament again to look at that. So a little bit more on that first thing, on the duty on public officials, because this is really what gives the Human Rights Act its teeth, because it allows us to hold public officials to account. So who has that duty? So there's sort of two categories of people who have duties under the Human Rights Act. The first one is fairly straightforward, that is public authorities. So things like local councils, the emergency services like the police, fire and ambulance, government departments, NHS trusts, etc. So sort of the arms of the state, public authorities. The other types of organisations who have duties under the Human Rights Act are those who are carrying out what's called public functions. And that could be a private company or it could be a charity, different types of bodies who are essentially delivering public services. So they could be delivering housing services or health or care or private prisons, for example. And these could be commissioned through a public authority, so there's public money directly involved, or they could be acting in lieu of public authorities, so carrying out the functions that, say, the local council would do if they weren't doing it. So, for example, housing associations have been found by the courts to be carrying out a public function. But the important thing to remember is that that first category of public authorities, they always have duties under the Human Rights Act, and they can't ever get rid of those duties. So even if they have commissioned out the service to somebody else, they still retain their duty under the Human Rights Act. So if there's uncertainty or we're not clear about whether a particular body that has been involved in Grenfell has a direct duty or not, we can always go back to the local council and always go back to those public authorities because they do have a duty to act. So what are those duties? There are essentially three duties under the Human Rights Act for public officials: to respect our rights, to protect our rights, and to make sure our rights are being fulfilled. So Geraldine's alluded to this already, so I won't spend very long on this, but essentially the respect duty is sometimes thought of as the negative duty, to just allow us to enjoy our rights, don't interfere with our rights. The positive duty is to take action, so it's to protect our rights, to take reasonable steps to protect our rights where they're known to be at risk. And then finally, to fulfil, there's a procedural duty attached to human rights, where that means that we have to have systems in place to make sure that we can try and prevent human rights breaches, but where they do occur, we need to investigate and find out what has gone wrong. So for Grenfell, the last two are the most relevant there, the positive duty and the procedural duty. And there will be questions that will need to be answered about whether there's been a failure by the local authority or others to protect the rights of residents, and then an investigation to establish what's gone wrong and where the responsibility lies. And we'll see that kicked off by the public inquiry. So I was going to give a little bit more information on both of these, but I think Geraldine has covered the positive duty pretty well. So thank you. I'm going to move straight on to the procedural duty. And I think Hillsborough, the disaster at Hillsborough, offers some lessons here for Grenfell. And there's a great piece on our BIHR's blog, Act for UK Rights, by Anna Morris, more about this, because she was one of the lawyers involved in the Hillsborough inquiry. So we all know what happened at Hillsborough with 96 people losing their lives. Lord Justice Taylor was appointed to lead a judicial inquiry. His interim report was published in July 1989. That's 3 months after the disaster. The report was pithy, it was a quick response, it established the facts, identified key issues and failings, and gave 43 recommendations. And that then got caught up in a political decision about whether to implement those recommendations, the Director of Public Prosecutions decided not to start to prosecute anyone, so the state response failed. It was the families and those who survived that used the Taylor report and kept on campaigning to make sure that they got justice. But it was years later that it came back onto the national agenda. So not until 2009, with a petition, getting it back into a Commons debate, led to disclosure of the documents. The independent panel was then set up, and they saw previously unseen evidence, and their report was damning, which led to a High Court ruling that the right to life in the Human Rights Act required that the first inquest verdicts, which found accidental death, should be quashed, and they ordered fresh inquests to take place. This time, though, the Human Rights Act was enforced, and those inquests had to comply with the Human Rights Act and that procedural duty to investigate. And this meant they were wider in scope, looking at the broader circumstances of the disaster, from the structure of a stadium to the emergency services response and the planning for the match. And importantly, the procedural duty also gives families of those who died more of a role in receiving documents, questioning the evidence and questioning the witnesses. And then finally, in 2016, the jury concluded that those 96 victims were unlawfully killed due to police failures, stadium design faults, and the delayed response by the ambulance service. So it took 27 years of campaigning, but the procedural duty to investigate Grenfell is going to include that public inquiry and will then be followed by inquests into the deaths and then potentially, as we've heard, criminal proceedings. And I think lessons need to be learned from Hillsborough to ensure that the survivors and the families of Grenfell don't have to have that same painful wait for answers and for justice.
Thank you. Informative talk, very insightful. Okay, last but not least, we're delighted to have John Cooper QC with us, and he's going to talk about some of the legal aspects in delivering justice for the victims of Grenfell. Thank you.
It's like one of those self-help groups, isn't it? I've got to declare, I admit I'm a lawyer. I'm dealing with it. I provisionally entitled what I want to talk about this evening simply Grenfell doing it justice. And what that really means is finding out what the truth is. And that word truth must ring through every adjunct that we use in the law to actually investigate, analyse, and try and work out what went wrong and what can be improved in the future. And I suppose one of the critical questions as far as the law is concerned, and I want to deal firstly with the strict confines of the law, then I'll go a little more wider than that, is can the law, is what we've got equipped to get to the truth? There are 4 ways that the law provides that ability, if it is indeed an ability. The public inquiry, the coroner's court, the criminal courts, and the civil courts. And these courts are going to be tasked, and we are going to be determined to make them understand it at each and every opportunity that it's the truth we want. But what is the truth? And I think it's important to define that question before anything starts at all. Now you'll all have your own views about what the truth is, but let me start the ball rolling for discussion. This is my stab at it. The truth is finding out why there has been a systemic breakdown of policy and provision of safe and habitable social housing, to include procurement of contractors and materials, strategic decisions made both locally and nationally, and the adequacy or inadequacy of ongoing monitoring of work and safety in such buildings. That's the truth. But it goes further, I'd say, than that. The truth is finding out why prior warnings and complaints and other observations about dangers relating to Grenfell and other similar social housing on a local and national scale were ignored. That's the truth, trying to find out answers to those questions. And the truth is examining the effectiveness and deficiencies of the response of local and national government in the face of the tragedy that occurred. Now, those truths we've put forward as being important elements of the terms of reference of this forthcoming public inquiry. Others are doing the same. And when I heard the judge of the inquiry immediately within hours of being given that appointment, immediately purporting to rule out a broad inquiry, to put it mildly, my heart sank. I'll come on to the public inquiry in a moment. But how dare he say that at such an early stage in the inquiry, when surely he'd not had an opportunity of maturely reflecting upon what the needs and requirements of that quest for truth, which is, after all, surely at the central core of any inquiry, dictates. And so it is important that we obtain the truth within the public inquiry, within the coroner's courts, within the criminal courts, within the civil courts, for accountability, for transparency, and for lessons that must be learned, and for justice to be done to those that lost their lives and the people they've left behind. It's important also, and I know that people here that have been so affected by the tragedy know this, but it's important that when it comes to lawyers and others working in this area, that we remember that although we as lawyers, and no doubt people here who have important contributions to make about the way forward, remember that the real world is that people affected at the moment have funerals to arrange. They've lost their possessions. They've lost their homes. They are displaced. Their lives, those that have kept them, have been disrupted to such an extent that many of us, including myself, can only imagine. And that is the background to our discussion here. And we're having an important discussion, bringing together people of like mind and different contributions to make. But let's remember that that is in the background to all this. Justice and the truth can never fully compensate for that. But the fight for justice will take place. It will be long and frustrating. But the public inquiry is here. And we must use and utilise that public inquiry for all its worth. But already I have concerns about the composition of that inquiry. I, in fact, am not calling, it's personally, for the judge to resign now. Notice the word now. It is important to work with the structure that we've got, but my goodness me, when I see 3 barristers appointed to assist him, one with tremendous Bernard Richmond of criminal experience, but the other 2 able people of integrity, but corporate lawyers. I worry that 2 corporate lawyers of extreme ability and integrity are going to assist a corporate judge with one excellent choice of a criminal barrister. But it goes further than that. You know, under the Inquiries Act 2005, ministers, and particularly the Prime Minister, has the power under Section 3, under Section 4, and under Section 11 to appoint additional panel members of expertise and diversity. to balance off the experience of the judge. Under Section 11, ministers have power to appoint assessors, people of experience and expertise, to advise the panel. I've not seen any of that yet. And so when we're discussing, in my view, the public inquiry, the questions that should be asked right at the top of the list is that we have power to make this inquiry inclusive, we have power to make this inquiry diverse, we have power to make this inquiry a group of individuals with the wide ranges of expertise needed to get to the truth. And we haven't got it yet. The terms of reference of this inquiry are important, and the input of survivors and those affected by this tragedy into those terms of reference are vital. And we wait to see in a few weeks' time whether all of our submissions to the judge are taken into account. But its terms of reference and its composition, those are the important things, in my opinion, we should be focusing on the public inquiry. And then comes the inquest, because there's been no doubt, contrary to what we've been hearing in some quarters, and as we can see from Hillsborough, there's still the opportunity for the inquest. And it could be an Article 2 inquest, a right to life inquest. But let's say just one thing about inquests. I know my time's short. I don't know whether any of you saw that tremendous drama that Jimmy McGovern wrote. Did you see that one scene in that programme where you had the inquest? I want to get a copy of that, because I do a lot of campaigning for legal aid and legal funding for inquests. When all the lawyers were being introduced as representing the NHS, the mental health services, the police, individual police officers, and they all introduced themselves. And then right at the end, the bereaved mother of the lad that was shot in this drama is introduced as representing herself. One of the big issues when it comes to an inquest, if it comes to an inquest, and it could come to an inquest, is funding. The bereaved should have funding, and at the moment in inquests, funding for the bereaved is an exceptional course. You do not get funding unless it is exceptional in inquests, if you are the bereaved. And I've done a number of inquests, some of them pro bono, because the bereaved do not have representation. That needs to change. And it sticks in my craw, wherever the craw may be. Work out where the craw actually is, but it sticks in it anyway. When I see at inquests the police, be it the National Health Service, if they're being criticised, mental health services, corporations, the army, if it be a military inquest, all funded with their lawyers, guess what? From taxpayers' money, your money, and the bereaved being told, you don't need funding, you don't need taxpayers' money, the coroner can look after you. Well, I'm yet to see a coroner pop into a conference room and give them advice as to how to persuade the coroner to come to a legal decision. It's ludicrous. These are the practical realities, and it's called access to justice. And access to justice is one of the most important aspects of what we as lawyers must achieve for our clients. Not the simple word that you'll get justice, but that you've got access to justice. I hear the dreaded rip of a piece of paper. Can I tell you, that rip of the piece of paper puts the fear of God into speakers. And I'm told 1 minute. Well, corporate manslaughter, I was going to deal with it. It's been ably dealt with by colleagues. I'm not going to repeat that. But let me just say this. If a corporate manslaughter charge is going to be brought, the CPS have to decide to do it. It's a CPS decision. They have to decide a threshold. Is it in the public interest? And is there a reasonable prospect of success? Those are the two criteria. Don't bank on it, I say. But I'll also say this one thing that hasn't been mentioned. If they don't, private prosecutions. I know they cost. Some people might do it without that. The point I'm making is this. Remember, the citizen has a right of a private prosecution. And you only need a group of 200, 300 citizens coming together, and you've got one. Long way down the line here, but remember private prosecution. Civil actions, of course, damages, homelessness, migration problems, welfare benefit. But you know what, in the 30 seconds I have, and probably there's going to be a lawyer's 30 seconds, so probably 60 seconds if you'll bear with me. It's not just the courts, because the courts, in my view, all of those, are not capable of delivering the justice that is required in Grenfell. This is political, and I'm sorry to have to say it, because some people don't like me saying that. Because this is not only legal, it is political. And it's not an accident, it's a crime. So let's just use the terminology. In America, for instance, use of politics and use of law go hand in hand. And we should not be ashamed or afraid to use the politics. As my colleague from the firefighters will know exactly how powerful that can be. Hand in hand with the law. This should not be normalisation. The comment made a little earlier about corruption being a normalisation of the situation. If there is, we don't know whether there is or there isn't at the moment. Process will tell. But it's a bit like something else I'm dealing with at the moment. We're challenging the government DUP deal at the moment. I know, I'm Mr. Popular. And one of the things we've been looking at is the normalisation of bribery. Watch this space. But these sort of things should not be normalised. And we should not let the court normalise it. We should not let the politicians normalise it. That's my final concluding remark here, really. Yes, the start of this, I confessed I was a lawyer. I'm ashamed to say so. But it's not just the law. Use everything at your disposal. The law, politics, your voice, your determination, your tenacity. And you know what? I've attended a few meetings in the community on this issue. You know what else? Use your anger. Thank you.
Hello? Can you, yeah. Okay, well, can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, well, thank you so much to all of our speakers. Please give them another round of applause. And thank you, of course, for all of you who attended tonight. We haven't quite concluded yet. There will be a Q&A session now. I would like to ask the panel a couple of questions, so I'll abuse my position as the chair very briefly here, and then I'll open it up to the audience for questions and comments. And please also make sure to identify yourselves if you can before you ask your question, or maybe contribute your insights or expertise as well. Right, so what I would like to know from the panel, and perhaps each of you could comment on this individually. I mean, you've described in great detail, Vicky, individual examples of people who have been evicted across the years, austerity as a contributing factor, socioeconomic factor, political decisions being made in terms of you know, getting people out of their areas, out of their residences, with little regard, I think, for their situation, individual situation, for their comforts, and I think for human dignity at the end of the day. This is also what we discuss. Certainly if we talk about the Human Rights Act, I think one of the purposes of the Human Rights Act is to protect individual human dignity, and that's what I always teach my students as well. So what I would like to find out from the panelists, so we talked about the public inquiry quite a lot, and we want this inquiry to be broad as possible. So I'd like to find out from each one of you, what exactly is it, and Jeremy Corbyn also mentioned this, right? He said it has to be multi-layered, it has to be a broad inquiry. We cannot just look at the legal aspect, we also have to look at the underlying socioeconomic reasons and causes that contributed to this disaster. So that's my first question. And again, so what would each one of you want to see in that inquiry? What kind of questions does that inquiry need to address? Number one, so please, yes, if you could, should we start with Matt?
Sure, I think the whole background regime under which housing, public housing operates in the UK, and the regime of public safety And at the point we're just finalising our submission on the terms of reference, I think a particular point that needs to be addressed is the specific decisions that have been made at various stages and the role of different people in advising on those decisions and in making those decisions. Because a whole series of ministers have, we're involved in lots of lobbying around fire safety issues, and we constantly run up into this brick wall, which is the opposition to so-called red tape. So we want to know who gave the advice and then who made the decision at a whole series of events. And if that means asking ministers to attend the inquiry, then I think they should be made to do so.
Vicky, yes? Would you like to take the microphone?
Yeah, just to kind of echo what I said in my talk really was that we have seen unprecedented levels of violence happening, housing violence happening in London. And Grenfell is definitely a continuation of that, also in the nature of the way in which it's targeted. You know, it's a working class community that was affected in the same way it's the working class communities that have been affected, you know, in London since 2010 and before 2010 as well, but amplified since 2010. So in terms of, you know, broaden out the inquiry, I definitely support the inquiry into housing, into adequate housing. That's absolutely key. I mean, what's happened, Joe made the point in the aftermath of Grenfell, it's ongoing violence. Those tenants are still displaced. They're still living in hotels. They were living in halls, you know, in halls in the local area for the first 2 nights. Some people were rough sleeping in the local park because there was no sustainable, adequate housing. So definitely the public inquiry has to be broadened out to include housing options, adequate housing, and also look at the way in which the nature of housing violence has been targeted over the past 7 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's not forget at the centre of all this is how a small elite have treated normal people. That's the centre of what this is really all about. And I touched upon it, I think, in what I said a moment ago, that in terms of a broad inquiry, and I also echo what colleagues have said about the need for a broad inquiry, this inquiry can't be in lockdown. It's got to be a broad inquiry to look at the systemic breakdown. And when I say systemic breakdown, it's an inquiry generally into social housing policy over decades that is at the root, in my opinion, of where we find ourselves at the end of this tragedy. We need to look at that, about procurement, of how social housing is procured, how it's maintained, how contractors are employed and involved. Again, we had some, well, I found it fascinating listening to other speakers, some very important material mentioned to us about contracts. Not necessarily PFIs were involved here, but it's the principle of PFIs, the principle of subcontracting, which is very important here. So, in short, the inquiry needs to look, amongst many, many other things, about the systemic breakdown of policy and provision in social housing, about strategic decisions made by local and national government on social housing, and how materials were procured and finally selected for social housing.
In terms of the sort of human rights laws and the European Convention and the Human Rights Act and that duty to investigate when there have been potential human rights breaches, loss of life, where people who work for the state were implicated or involved, there has to be an independent investigation into that. And for Grenfell, that means into the causes. What caused the deaths in the fire, and there needs to be remedies that come out of that, potentially criminal accountability, compensation for victims, and then changes to laws and policies. So what we want to learn is what went wrong, but then try to change it so that it doesn't happen in the future. That's the whole point of the procedural investigation. And I've been reading quite a lot about this over the last few days and weeks in terms of the scope of the inquiry, how it definitely needs to cover the sort of the history of the tower block, the history of Grenfell Tower, and the design of it, and how it was planned and subsequent sort of modifications and inspections and things. Also then what happened on the night, how the fire started and why it was able to spread so quickly, but then the aftermath and the sort of the response on the night and in the days afterwards in terms of the sort of systemic failures. But then I think there are wider issues as well around this issue of social housing, which I know the residents are calling for the inquiry remit to be widened out to. But also, so that it doesn't happen again, we need a review of those laws and the regulations or lack of that caused it, so that we can refresh and update, and so that those regulations can be relied upon in future, so we don't end up talking about this again. What I don't know is whether all of those things should be done at the same time, because as I said with Hillsborough, one of the good things about the Taylor inquiry, which took 3 months, it was quick and people got answers, and then that gave the survivors and the families something to hold on to. It gave them a tool to use to campaign. And when the political will wasn't there to implement the recommendations, and when the Director of Public Prosecutions wasn't going to prosecute, they had that report with really good recommendations in it and the facts. And that's what you need. You need answers fast so that we can get changes fast. And then I think these wider questions, I don't know whether they should come later. I don't want Hillsborough 27 years to get justice to happen again.
Steve?
Thanks. Yeah, on the day that many of us here learnt the words Grenfell Tower, the day that we learnt of the fire, the day the fire started, that morning I was going off to an academic conference, a day thing at the University of Liverpool to talk, and the conference was about the role of emotion in politics. And I decided to talk about the language of hatred which exists around regulation. And of course, no one was going to be people generally aren't interested in what I have to say, and no one was going to be interested in me talking about health and safety regulation that morning. But of course, very suddenly, they were very fucking interested. Very interested indeed. Yeah. And like many people now taking regulation very seriously. And in my submission around the terms of reference of the inquiry, I've asked for 3 broad contextual issues to be considered. And one of them is around, and I think the hatred around regulation, by the way, is a class hatred. I should also say that. One of the contextual features I've asked to be considered is the way in which an anti-regulation rhetoric has been encouraged, deliberately encouraged, by both Labour and Conservative and indeed Liberal governments in coalition. How these have been encouraged, facilitated, cultivated, nurtured, and the consequences of that anti-regulation rhetoric. And I tend not to talk about regulation much these days. I tend to talk about social protection, because I think that's what regulation is. And what Grenfell Tower is, among many things, is the complete absence of breakdown of social protection for those who deserve it most.
Thanks very much. Most people have said what I would say, and I would agree very much with Steve and very much with Matt. And I think I would want the inquiry to look at the systematic breakdown of the health and safety system, the social protection system, and how it came to be seen as anathema, and as Steve has talked about, the anti-regulation rhetoric and the hatred of regulation. And I back up what Matt says. I think we need a really clear timeline about how this all developed and who made the decisions and when and how. And that should include deregulation, better regulation, and also the cuts to enforcement and the changes in enforcement when enforcement became subject to business-only considerations and it's become privatised and commercialised and outsourced. Because I think we really need to be very clear that the health and safety system in this country has been utterly destroyed and broken down by this deregulation rhetoric. And if we don't fix that, we can't fiddle about with it. It involves everything everybody has said. We can't just fix the fire safety bit of it. It's the whole system. Otherwise, this will go on happening again and again. And if anything, we have to make Grenfell Tower the enough is enough moment and end deregulation, end better regulation, and get back to having proper morally, well, had to have an essential system whereby protecting people's lives and health comes before everything else. Thank you.
John wants to make a quick comment, yes?
Could I also say this, and I think it's important we're talking about what we want for the public inquiry, but there's something even more pressing at the moment, which we need to be very vocal about, and that's the preservation of evidence. We're all quite rightly focusing upon, in many respects, years hence as to what importantly needs to be done. But what needs to be done as of this evening, if not yesterday, is steps to be taken to preserve the documents, to preserve the contracts, to preserve the emails, to preserve the text messages, to preserve all that, and also to preserve the crime scene. I'm sorry to refer to people's homes, because, of course, fundamentally, it was a home, a place of life and family, the tragedy of it. But it's a crime scene. And one of the things that's important to me is that once the police have completed their investigation, and they must be given that time, or whether it's the fire services or whoever are investigating the crime scene, we, all those that represent the interests of survivors and bereaved, should also, unusually, and this is an unusual situation, be given access to that crime scene for our own experts to have a look at it. So that if, for instance, the police say something, and with due respect, say the fire service say something, which may be right, it may be wrong, that we, representing a bereaved, representing survivors, can, if necessary, road test what is found on the crime scene. And so we can satisfy ourselves that it is either accurate and reliable or inaccurate. Preservation of evidence is the number one thing at the moment we should be focusing on.
Well, thank you very much. So what I would like to do now is open it to you, the audience, for questions. As I mentioned earlier, I would very much appreciate it if you could identify yourselves and try to keep your questions as short as possible. So we will take them in threes, please. Yes?
Yeah, very, very short. I'm a housing activist across the road. I'm totally non-academic on the Ocean Estate. And I led the campaign that stopped the developers and kept all the residents with the council about 10 years ago now. It's just a question, especially around what John was mentioning. I've got a feeling, I don't know, I'm not an expert, that if this was France or Italy, there would be examining and investigative magistrates already appointed the day or two afterwards. All these documents would already be impounded, as David Lammy has asked for, and the criminal case would be underway. Because I echo what Joe was saying and what the survivors are saying, we would like people behind bars. Because if they're behind bars, then there's a likelihood that this just might not happen again. And it would happen in other countries, and they would be behind bars. I don't know why this is Britain, but what I would like to know, and Joe mentioned, and I'm winding up, is the cabinet and certain characters that he's mentioned in the cabinet, and I'll mention them, what was his name, Fielding Mellon, and the rest of them. Now, I would like a trail of what happened. He asked for good costs in these emails, and we know that £300,000 was involved. I'd like to see these trails if there's bribery or corruption or larceny involved in this. Now, I'm not pussyfooting around it. This was a disgraceful episode. And so definitely survivors and the rest in England would like to find out, are you going to prosecute? And as you said yourself, is there a reasonable prospect of this happening, or is it just going to be another British establishment cover-up?
Let me deal with that. Obviously, it touches upon what material the prosecution ultimately will be given to make that decision. And the first thing to say is that it is very important that evidence be preserved. The coroner at the moment has been appointed, and so the coroner does have a duty already to be doing that. But there are steps that can be taken. For instance, we've issued what's called Part 30, Practice Direction 31B letters. Now, Practice Direction 31B letters, which we've sent out, are letters to all concerned, and we've sent them out to the local authority, local council, national government, all contractors we can isolate, telling them that they must now preserve all evidence, that they must preserve electronic evidence. They must not only preserve electronic evidence, but they must preserve, so far as they can, deleted materials which have gone into trash boxes. So this Part 31B letter we've sent out to every single person, and it can be sent out, quote, where civil proceedings are being contemplated. Well, guess what? We're contemplating them. And we've sent these Part 31B letters out now. And if, as a result of these letters being sent out to, we even sent them out to Hotpoint, if these letters are ignored, well, that can cause severe difficulties to those parties later on in the proceedings if they say they've been deleted. We're doing all we can. We're doing all we can, short of going into the offices and putting a lager around the shredding machines. But as you say, it's slow, and there isn't an examining justice here. And therefore, it's very much left down to those representing survivors to do this.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Okay. Yep. Yes, sorry. Okay, yes.
Hi. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. What does the fire service need in investment terms to restore your services back to an international quality level so we can prevent and fight any other fires properly?
Well, well, where do we start? The scale of the cuts that we've had, I mean, the thing about the fire service, we're a very small part of public services, but I suppose it's hopefully what the deregulation that we've been through is a microcosm of everything else, and it's particularly relevant in this case, or parts of it are relevant in this case. We, since 2010, 11,000 firefighter posts have gone. There are only something like, so that's about 20% of the total workforce. 70 fire stations closed, dozens and dozens of fire engines. But I think the particular relevance to this is the fire safety regime, and I think the example I gave of Greater Manchester, I mean, I just found that out today, quite staggering figures in terms of specialists who understand building regulations, fire safety regimes, fire protection in buildings, and the fact that that's the scale of the cut. Because it's easier to get rid, it's quite controversial to close a fire station, they still do it, but it's controversial to close a fire station, it's less controversial to get rid of a group of so-called back office specialists, because people don't notice that until something goes horrifically wrong. So our position is the cuts need to immediately be stopped and then to be reversed. How much will that cost? I don't know.
Okay. Yes, I think the gentleman in the blue shirt over there, please.
Hello. Yeah, under the years I've been in social housing and in construction, we've seen architects' departments closed down, engineers' departments closed down, documentation being lost. You couldn't even find a drawing to show the layout of a building, never mind the way it's been built. All that information just vanished almost overnight, and no one wants to preserve that information. It was then all passed over to contractors, to consultants, and we have a process today where you got a project manager who's not necessarily a technical person, just an administrator more than anything, who employs a consultant, and they do that tendering process to employ. So all the expertise is supposed to come from other people. So the consultant then comes on board, and you've got also, you're supposed to have under construction design and management another consultant, but they found that was too expensive, so they joined the two consultants together, so the design element is now controlled by the same person. And what it's supposed to do is, quoting from the new legislation, so the risk to those who have to build, use and maintain a structure is reduced. So that I thought that included only, originally, the construction process itself, to make sure that health and safety in the construction process was managed and controlled. But no, it's the eventual use of the building, and for all those who will use the building in perpetuity after that, even down to the destruction of the building process. So what we're getting today is everything being watered down in the hands of a consultant who then passes it to a contractor, and they pass the risk over every time. And if we've got 7 contractors, as it was said, in the Grenfell process, then that risk element is being passed down all the time. But the overarching control is supposed to be in the hands of the client. And in this case, the client is a local authority. And that's
Can I just ask you to maybe phrase a question if you do have a question for our panel? Yes.
So, but well, to ask the QC, for example, where you've got all these layers, and I think that's what Jeremy Corbyn's on about, the issue of the management of the construction refurbishment process, the funding inadequacies, the regulations and standards that are put forward, and the responsibilities at each layer that goes with that. Unpicking that is very difficult in litigation because there's all these layers involved. Who is responsible at the end of the day?
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I won't repeat what I said to the gentleman a moment ago about the importance of preserving this material. And it's telling to say that, and I've got Fatima here now, and she'll be able to probably bring me better up to speed, but of all the letters we've sent out to people asking them to preserve documentation, I think, Fatima, I don't know if it's right, we've only got 2 responses back saying that they are going to do that. And so it is very difficult indeed to get through those layers. There's no simple answer to that question apart from diligence and application. It can be done. You know, no one's as clever as they think, including the lawyers. No one's as clever as they think, and lawyers and the police and investigators, whoever they may be, are very skilled in tearing down these walls. It can be done. People have come through the courts, be they civil or the criminal courts, through the ages, thinking things are hidden, and they've been found out. The answer to your question, in short, is time, diligence, and determination, and we've got all of that.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Grant. I'm a victim of a very grave violation of the rule of law and indeed human rights. It's very refreshing to hear a lawyer speak in the way that the QC has this evening. I believe if all lawyers approach situations such as Grenfell in the way that you described this evening, I believe we wouldn't have the likes of Hillsborough, where we have to fight and pursue justice for 27 years. The reason I've come here tonight, when I heard about this meeting taking place, is because I want to be as helpful as I possibly can to the people of Grenfell, because that tragedy is something, I'm sure, as indeed with everybody else in this room, it's the worst thing I've ever gone through. In fact, no. The worst thing was losing one of my own children, or having to bury one of my own children. So I immediately had empathy with those who were perishing in that horrific fire. Again, as I said, the reason I've come here, you've mentioned about the judge or the suitability of Morbic to deal with that matter. What I have here is a bundle of documents that comes from the courts, which when he was a Lord Justice Morbic, and he had a direct hand in covering up or assisting the covering up of the circumstances involved in the death of my 15-month-old child. Not only that, he had a direct hand in me having to spend 6 solid years locked up in prison following an unlawful conviction. Now, to put this in simple terms, because I know you'll all understand it, following my unlawful conviction, I filed an application seeking permission to appeal. It was initially refused on paper by Mr. Justice Butterfield. I then renewed the application to go into court to have an oral hearing, as is of right, and a panel of judges, including Lord Justice Kennedy, Mr. Justice Morrison, and Mr. Justice Elias, conducted those proceedings in my absence without giving me the opportunity to be heard. The judgment delivered by Mr. Justice Elias is in this document. Now, following my release...
I'm sorry to have to interrupt you, but just if
sure.
you could just
I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going to wrap it up now. Following my release, and this is the relevance of Morbic, Following my release from prison, I then had another opportunity to appeal against they were trying to seize my assets. Now, I had a hearing in court in front of Morbick, Lord Justice Ward, and Lord Justice Elias. Now, despite my protestation at Elias being on that bench, on that appellate bench, where I was appealing against his decision, Morbick delivered a judgment saying that there was nothing they could do, despite my human rights in this matter, there was nothing that they could do, even if they wanted to, despite the fact that human rights state, a person who claims to be a victim of any unlawful act may rely on that in any legal proceedings instigated against them by the state. I want to submit this document to you so that I've already submitted it to the Grenfell inquiry, so that you yourself can examine the details of this document and submit it if you so
Thank
wish.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Helen perhaps can address briefly what the legal avenues are under the Human Rights Act, and then I think John can maybe talk about practical advice. Yes. Yeah.
So very briefly, because as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds like there are some potential issues there around your right to a fair trial, which is Article 6 of the Human Rights Act. If there are proceedings that are happening without you being notified and without you being present, if a judge who's already passed judgment in your case is then passing judgment on your appeal to that case. So there's potentially an avenue there that you can follow, but as I say, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll pass it on to the lawyer.
Oh, well, there you are, that's the hot potato. Thank you, by the way, for your opening comments. I do appreciate that. As far as your issue is concerned, I'm going to have someone... have you got a copy of those documents? Can I make it clear that lawyers will know the old rule, we never take originals, because we lose them. It's the old rule we're always taught. So if they're copies and you've got originals to keep yourself, we'll take a copy. If you haven't got copies, we'll arrange for you to send them to me, and I'll have a look at them. But on a more general position, very quickly indeed, obviously I'm worried, as I expressed before, about the composition of this public inquiry. We need to watch it very carefully. Past record of Theresa May and her appointment of chairs of public inquiries does not engender confidence.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question. So I'm afraid it has to be the last one. So I don't know who had their gentleman in the... Okay, 2 questions, yes.
Hi, my name's Ranjan. Somebody told me the other day that the Lawrence family, for the Macpherson thing, they objected to Macpherson, and their lawyers tried to get a different person to rule that, and they weren't able to, but that they were able to have some kind of influence over those people surrounding him, and that was what made the difference. I think you were kind of talking about that sort of thing before. Who would be doing the parallel or corresponding? Who would be doing that now, and how would anyone go about that? Let's say one were to try and copy that.
Or perhaps somebody else would like to address that?
Well, just to say that we were at the public inquiry this morning at Regent's Park, and that was raised a number of times. The legal advisor for the residents of Grenfell has taken that up explicitly in terms of the terms of reference, and it was raised a number of times by other people in the group. So I think the residents group are working on that, or figuring out ways to actually influence the review panel, the inquiry panel, which is not diverse at all.
Yeah, just to add to that, I'm a director, I'm on the board and a trustee of the organisation, the Charity Inquest, and one of our fellow trustees also made that point that he objected as a barrister to the appointment of Macpherson along with the Lawrence family. I mean, Inquest do have experience in these matters, and they are working with organisations on the ground around these and other issues, and so I think a lot of that kind of stuff is going on, but clearly it's quite sensitive and is not going on in the public domain for obvious reasons.
I'm already discussing it with them.
Okay. Yes, our final question. I think the lady here in front had... Yes, I can pass the microphone to you.
I'd just like to say thank you so much for doing this and for caring and for supporting our community. I want to say that the focus should always be on the families who lost loved ones, us who lost friends, the children, the people who are now struggling. It's a very difficult time because nobody's thinking straight at the moment. And yes, in an ideal world, we'd all get cracking on with the job of getting these people prosecuted, but nobody's emotionally ready at the moment, so you'd have to be very, very patient with us. We have a lot of questions that can't be answered all, and our lives were hell before Grenfell for us TMO tenants, and our lives continue to be hell under TMO, right? So what I'm asking on behalf of people who are not here is, how do we nail the TMO and the individuals like health and safety executives who are sitting there writing us nasty letters, terrorizing us, making our lives hell? How do we get these people? This is my question.
John? Yes? Okay.
You know what I hate the most? Bullies. I can't stand bullies. Bullies. Sorry, it's my Wolverhampton accent coming out there. I've tried to be so posh tonight. It's just it slipped out there. I hate bullies. It's the thing that's driven me in my whole life. And these people that you mention, and it goes back to something I said in my short address a moment ago. Sometimes you can't deal with people through the law. You have to deal with them through politics, and you have to deal with them through public pressure, through pressure on them publicly, through politics. Through forcing people to account. Now, sometimes the courts of law are not the place to do that. Sometimes the political arena is the place to do that. The law is sometimes inadequate, and I accept that. The corporate manslaughter law is utterly inadequate when you consider all potential culprits faces a fine. So the criminal law is inadequate. The public inquiry, in its broad terms of reference, is inadequate. Inquests, providing you get even public fundings, are inadequate. And civil remedies, providing you can get, again, public funding to take them and take the risk, is inadequate. In many respects, the answers that you want come through pressure on your political representatives.
Would anybody else like to comment on this? Perhaps, yes, Helen? I had some notes on a final thought, which I didn't get time to do, and it's sort of relevant to what you're talking about. I don't know whether it will be enough, but there's something around human rights which is very powerful, because human rights are there to redress power imbalances. And in this kind of situation where you feel like someone else or a body or an organisation has lots of power, and you as residents, as a community, even though there's probably more of you, you feel quite powerless, and you've been placed in quite a powerless situation by them. Human rights can be there to give you a little bit of power back, because as I was saying before, human rights are the one bit of law that we have to hold people to account. And they might come back with all their lawyers and say, no, the Human Rights Act doesn't apply to us. But you can try and use that powerful language, and at least it gives you a tool to go to them with and ask to be treated as a human being. And as a survivor of that disaster, as a friend and family member of people who've lost their lives, you deserve to be treated with that dignity.
Okay. Anybody else? No. Okay. I think we have to leave it at this, I'm afraid. I would like to briefly summarize. I think we've only probably scraped the surface tonight in our debate of so many underlying issues, multidimensional issues that really need to be explored. So I'm extremely grateful, hugely grateful for all your contributions, which have touched upon, I think, the impact of austerity on the weakest in society, but also, I think, a systemic degradation and breakdown of social housing in this country, of fire safety regimes, of health and safety controls, and maybe also, as Steve talked about, certainly maybe a systemic attack on the working class in this country, which has been going on for decades, and I think has been perpetuated by both mainstream political parties, certainly under the deregulation agenda, which many of you touched upon tonight. And I think it is very important, as Helen pointed out, to remind ourselves that there is, in addition to criminal legislation, also human rights legislation, the Human Rights Act, which, you know, has come under so much sustained attack over the years, but luckily is still in place, which can address perhaps some of the issues that we discussed tonight. And provide some sort of remedy for the victims. So I think on that note, and I'm sure that this will only be the first of many series of events that we're planning to hold, I would like to leave it on this note and once again thank the panel for their outstanding contributions and thank you as an audience for being here tonight.